Hello, everybody. My name is Charlene Garcia Sims, and I am the Genealogy and Special Collections Librarian here at Rawlings. I also have with me Bob Craig. Bob, sneak your face over a little bit here. Hello. And Bob is president of the Genealogical Society of Hispanic America, GSHA, who is co-sponsoring this event. In the last 20 years, genetic genealogy, or DNA testing as we know it, has come to the forefront of the genealogy world, adding a new facet to studying your family tree. DNA tests that you can take at home have become very popular with four major companies: Family Tree DNA, Ancestry.com, 23andMe, and MyHeritage, plus other small ones. As the results get more sophisticated, it's important to understand the ramifications of these results and how you can best use them. Libby Copeland, who I'm so glad to have here, has written a very timely book about how these home DNA tests are upending who we are, and we need to be aware of all that has to be considered with home DNA tests. Now, Libby Copeland is an award-winning journalist and author who writes from New York about culture, science, and human behavior. As a freelance journalist, she writes for such media outlets as The Atlantic, New York and Smithsonian, the New York Times, New Republic, Esquire.com, and the Wall Street Journal. Her book, The Lost Family, How DNA Testing is Upending Who We Are, was published in March 2020 by Abrams Press. It's been a hard year, I'm sure, for all this, but congratulations. The Lost Family explores the rapidly evolving phenomenon of home DNA testing, its implications for how we think about family and ourselves, and again, its ramifications for American culture broadly. The Wall Street Journal says, it's a fascinating account of lives dramatically affected by genetic sleuthing. The New York Times writes, before you spit in that vial, read this book. I love that title. The Washington Post says, The Lost Family reads like an Agatha Christie mystery and wrestles with some of the bigger questions in life. Who are we? What is family? Are we defined by nature, nurture, or both? Our program today is composed of questions to Libby that she's going to answer about her book. Please hold off any questions until the end or type them into chat. And welcome, Libby. And I'm going to start with the first question, and then Bob is going to take over for most of them, okay? So how did you come to write The Lost Family, How DNA Testing is Upending Who We Are? And please tell us about the book and what you mean by nature and nurture.
Sure. Thank you for having me, Charlene. And it's lovely to be here with you and with Bob, who I see popping into the screen. Hi, Bob. I came to write the book because of my interest in this intersection of technology and psychology. I have been a reporter for 22 years, and I spent the first half of that at the Washington Post, and the second half of that freelancing for a wide variety of magazines and newspapers, and writing stories about, why we do the things that we do, human motivation, personal narrative, how we kind of form our identities. And I was very interested in science in the last few years and had been writing more science stories. And I was in conversation with I see a lot of people just joined. So I will just back it up a little bit so that those people who just joined can hear. So Charlene had just asked me how I came to write The Lost Family, which is a book about DNA testing and society. I started because I was a reporter I've been a reporter for 22 years and had moved into science. And about 3 years ago, I was in conversation with my editor at the Washington Post. And we were talking about the way that technology, like DNA testing, intersects with our most intimate lives. So a lot of people are into DNA testing now. Sometimes there are folks who have been into family history for years and for decades. Some, like my father, have been doing genealogy since before there was an internet, let alone before there was DNA testing. And others are casual consumers. And for both those groups, as well as for those who set out, sort of the third bucket of people who are drawn to it, people who set out with a specific question, a question that they want to answer. For instance, what's the identity of my birth mother? For all those groups, DNA testing can be a kind of profound process of discovery. And sometimes in the process of testing, you discover the answer to a question you hadn't asked. For instance, a lot of people discover, not the majority by any means, but a significant minority of people who test discover that they're not, for instance, genetically related to their dad. a phenomenon that's known as a non-paternity event or not parent expected. In this world of genetic genealogy, it's known as an NPE, sometimes MPE for misattributed parentage experience. So I was interested in the sort of like mismatch between expectations and outcome. And I was interested then in the process of discovery and the kind of journey of I guess, of the self, right? If all of a sudden you discover your father is a stranger, someone you never met, and that half of your genetic ancestry is completely different than the line that you traced for the last 10 years, what does that do to your sense of kind of orientation on this planet, right? And what does that do to the arc of your own personal story? And how does that change your conversations with people you've just met and people you've known all your life? And how does it change your relationships with your most intimate family members? All these things are affected and affected deeply. So I wrote a story for the Washington Post 4 years ago now, and it was about the unexpected consequences of DNA testing, the journeys that we can go on. And I got this flood of reader email, 400 emails in the first month after the story ran. And they were from people who wanted to tell me about how DNA testing had changed their lives. And they were such a broad demographic. They were such a kind of sweeping expanse of the human experience, right? In all its joys and its disappointments, rejections, heartwarming reunions, profound experiences. And I decided I wanted to write a book. And that's how the Lost Families first started for me.
Okay, well, thank you, Libby. Before I go on with the questions, I just want to remind everybody that we'll take questions after we've asked our initial questions. I apologize for those that came in late. You didn't miss anything. We're in a different venue, so we had a little bit of different setup. So, and I want to show you the book that we're talking about. If you can see that, maybe I'm too close here. So we will talk about where you can get this book after the questions. So thank you for everybody for joining us. So Libby, thank you for being here. We appreciate it. So second question, why do people take DNA tests?
Yeah, so, there's a number of reasons why you might want to take a test. And I divided this into basically 3 buckets, which I think I started to allude to. There's people who are longtime genealogists. There's those who, start out with a question. So a lot of folks have figured out how to use DNA because, to make an end run out of basic mysteries they would have never been able to solve otherwise. A person who grows up without knowing the identity of his genetic dad, for instance, or someone who's adopted who lives in a state where they can't get access to original birth certificates, and that would give them the names of their birth parents, and they want to know that because for a lot of reasons, because it's central to identity, because it's central to understanding your medical history, because it's a question that you might not want to have unanswered for your whole life. And so that's sort of the second bucket of people, right? People who set off with a question, and longtime genealogists is the first bucket. And the third bucket is the casual consumer. And that's sort of the category I find myself in when I got the test a few years ago as a gift. And a lot of people sort of fall into DNA testing because it is broadly known as the recreational DNA testing industry. It is marketed as entertainment. You see the ads on TV, they promise that you're going to get that ethnicity estimate, which is that pie chart that looks so much fun, and that pie chart is going to bring you closer to your family. It's going to help you discover your own story. And a lot of people envision this as a relatively small investment purchase, right? So if you want to get an ancestry test and you wait for it when it's on sale, it could be as little as $49. And a lot of people sort of assume that the greatest cost of the test is the price. But the investment is far greater, and the implications can be much greater than that. And I wanted to follow the sort of stories of different people to see, how does this play out in people's lives when they get something unexpected, or when they're able to find their family, in the case of adoptees, through DNA testing. How does that radically change their lives? And how do people on the other side feel about being found? Because we can talk about this, but increasingly you don't need to be in a database, you don't need to have tested in order to be identified by someone who's related to you, because the databases are simply so large now.
Thank you. So in your book, you said with more than 35 million people having taken a home DNA test, the majority of them being Americans, you say that America has reached a tipping point. What are the implications of that, and what do you mean by tipping point?
So, you know, we share genetic segments with our third and fourth cousins and fifth cousins and people who we've never met, right? Strangers to us, we may not even know their surnames. And yet the act of testing means that I am effectively opting in people who are related to me, who I may never have met. So what does that mean in practical terms? Let's take a theoretical example. Let's say that I have a brother, and my brother conceived a child when he was 16 years old. He was in high school. He had a girlfriend. They had a child. He didn't know it. Okay. He grows up. He gets married. Now he's in his late 40s, and he has children and a wife. And unbeknownst to him, he also has a daughter who is all grown up, and she is looking for the identity of her genetic dad. He doesn't need to test and show up in a database in order for her to find him. She could test at one of the larger databases. And let's say I'm his sister, right? And I test. It's very easy for her to then figure out his identity. She can look me up. She can, research me a little bit from the robust, breadcrumbs, the digital breadcrumbs that I leave about myself online. She can figure out who my brother is. Maybe I have more than one. And she can reach out to me, or she can simply reach out to my brother. If there's one or two, she might write a letter to, if I have three brothers, she might write a letter to all three. And she can sort of make a connection that way. And that could be something experiences as painful and difficult. It could be something that he experiences as incredibly wonderful. It could be something that he sees as a blessing and his wife does not see as a blessing. And all those kinds of stories, those family stories, those 360s of different experiences about a single revelation are some of the stories that I tell in The Lost Family. And the whys, why do people react the way they do? But I mean, stepping away from that for a moment, I don't actually need to be as close as a sister in order for this man, this theoretical man who conceived a child in high school, to be identifiable. I could be his first cousin. I could be his second cousin. I could even theoretically be a third cousin. So she could figure out his identity from several distant cousins. And again, a third cousin, if you think about it, as someone who is very distantly related to you from a most recent common ancestor that's pretty far back. And we might not know each other. And yet my decision implicates him into this technology. So what that means for us as a culture is that the era of family secrets is effectively over. If there is a secret of a genetic nature in your family, it's going to come out. It's a matter of time. And that means that we need to have different kinds of conversations. And particularly for those people who are in possession of knowledge about someone else's genetic origins that they may not know themselves, that means that those people have to start thinking about whether to disclose that truth before that truth comes to those individuals by way of a DNA test, either their own DNA test or somebody else's.
Thank you. Fourth question, you write about NPEs, non-paternal events or non-parent expected. Please explain this term and how common are they?
Right. So I sort of jumped ahead of you a little bit, and I talked about NPEs a little bit earlier. So non-paternity event, right, or not parent expected, it can broadly describe the experience of discovering you're not genetically related to either or both parents. But practically speaking, it's typically the discovery that you're not genetically related to dad. And that experience is between 1% and 2% of the population, according to the best data that I've found, and it changes based on country and culture. So that's like kind of an average, and it's an imperfect average. But the best number I've seen is 1.9%. That experience blended with the other most common experience that I found, which is the discovery of a previously unknown half-sibling. those are probably the two most common. But some of the other major buckets of surprise revelation are the discovery that you were donor conceived and not told for very understandable reasons, particularly if you were conceived 60 years ago at a time when donor conception was heavily stigmatized or was simply considered very private. And doctors even discouraged parents from telling their children. That's another sort of bucket of discovery people are making right now. I write in the book about a woman who discovers she's adopted through a DNA test. That's another kind of category. And the last kind of category, major category of surprise, is the discovery that your family may have hidden genetic ancestry. So for all sorts of reasons, including assimilation, conversion, and escape from discrimination, there are people who are testing into tubes, they're spitting into tubes, and they're discovering that some key aspect of their genetic ancestry wasn't communicated to them. It was forgotten. It was intentionally not told because their family was making a decision to pass or to be something other than sort of what their genetic ancestry would be. And altogether, those experiences are easily in the low single digits. I say, conservatively speaking, if it's 3% of people, then we're at over a million, over a million people who've had a significant unexpected surprise of that kind of the 35 million people who've tested. But the true measure of this is actually bigger because each single revelation refracts across a lot of people. So if I make a discovery that I'm not genetically related to my dad, that has implications for me. It has implications for him, for my mom and their relationship, for my siblings, and who are now discovering that they're genetically half siblings to me. And then elsewhere, say 2 states away, there's a stranger who contributed half my genetic material. And I may want to reach out to him and get to know him and have a relationship with him, or at least find out a little bit more about his family. So it has implications for him. It has implications for his wife and their marriage, and for his children, who I'm now discovering are my newfound genetic half siblings, right? So each act of discovery and surprise, if you're spitting into a vial, potentially is impacting 8 to 10 people. So that's millions of Americans right now whose lives are being changed. And I think it's a really important moment. I think it's a really important seismic change to our culture, and we need to be talking about it.
Okay. This next question, I think you've pretty much already answered, but I'm going to move on to the next one. So what are the implications of DNA testing and ethnicity? Ethnicities.
I understand.
I'm sorry.
It's the math.
The mask.
What are the implications on understandings of ethnicity? Is that what you asked?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. So this is one of the most interesting, aspects of the book. The 4 major companies, the largest of the 4 major companies in terms of database size is Ancestry. They have 18 million, at least, I think it might be 19 million people in their database of the total, which is 35 million DNA test kits sold. So more than half. And they are a pretty big deal. They kind of popularized the term ethnicity estimate, which is the description of the pie chart that you get when you take a DNA test. So I'll back up and explain for folks here who maybe haven't taken a test. When you take a DNA test, you're getting 2 major buckets of information. One is your list of DNA relatives, and that's people who have tested with the same company, and they're showing up as related to you because you and they share overlapping genetic segments. And the other key piece of information you're getting is your ethnicity estimate, which is a picture of where the various branches of your tree hail from in terms of genetic ancestry, anywhere from, say, 500 to 1,000 years ago. But the term ethnicity estimate is kind of imperfect. And it's imperfect because ethnicity is actually not just genetic ancestry, right? You can't conflate the two, because ethnicity could be as well the culture that you're raised in, the songs that are sung to you when you're falling asleep at night as a child, the foods that you eat, the language that you speak. And all of that may not be the same as your genetic ancestry, or it may be that you honor a particular piece of your genetic ancestry more so than the rest of it for a variety of reasons. I know I personally do relate more to some pieces of my own pie chart, right? Because those are the pieces that I grew up with. Those are the pieces that inform my identity more greatly. And so, to suggest that your genetic ancestry is the same as ethnicity is a bit of an issue. And what I saw over and over again is that people struggled with this challenge of how much to make of this, right? If you believed yourself to be one thing and you're discovering you're another, to what extent are you honoring the thing that you never knew versus the way that you identified? And I found that people, there's a concern among sociologists that it's as easy as that ad. There's an ancestry ad called the Kyle ad, where he says, I grew up thinking I was one thing, I found out that I was another, so I traded in my lederhosen for a kilt. And you see him wearing lederhosen because he thinks that he's German, and then you see him in another scene wearing a kilt because he's discovered he's Scottish. And the implication for this very effective ad is that, that ethnicity is as easy as a costume change. And of course we know that it isn't, right? And a number of sociologists that I interviewed, expressed concern that that there would kind of be a kind of a flattening of human understanding of the distinctions, right? And that we might somehow throw over everything we'd ever known in favor of what our genes told us. And if so, are we kind of essentially being genetic essentialists? When I interviewed people, I found that they resolved these questions with a great deal of nuance and emotional intelligence, right? So whether it came to this question of nature versus nurture, which is essentially what we're asking, with regard to the family or with regard to ethnicity, that question of, which is more important, people found it to be, and I find it to be, that kind of ranking really not a great frame, right? It's overly simplistic to suggest that one could be more powerful than the other, that you could actually figure that out and hold it in your hands. The reality is that people say yes and they say that in matters of the heart. So if a man raised you and he's your dad and you adore him and he tucked you in every night, and you find out at 35 years old that he's not genetically related to you, that man does not cease to be dad. But it's also not the case that the man who is genetically related to you, who did contribute half your genetic material, it's also not the case necessarily that you have no interest in him, right? You might be very curious to find out more about him, and that doesn't reflect on a lack of love that you have for your dad who raised you. The limits of language for us here are really hampering us because we don't yet have words for some of these new relationships that are defined by the DNA age, right? We don't have a word for that man who contributed half your genetic material if you already have a dad. But we need that language. And likewise in the world of ethnicity, I found over and over that people said yes and. They said I am this and I am also that. Where I come from informs me now that I know that I took a DNA test, but that doesn't mean that I'm going to forget everything that came before. And in my book, I tell the story, a really moving story of a man named Rosario who was told that he was Sicilian as a child and grew up with that and really embraced his Italian heritage. And it wasn't until his early 50s when he did DNA testing in combination with genealogy that he discovered he wasn't Sicilian at all. His mother had told him that he was Sicilian because she was trying to protect him from the knowledge that he was in fact, he was biracial, as she was. And she had grown up as a biracial child in a white rural community in Vermont, and she had experienced significant discrimination, and she was not going to let that happen to her baby. So she told him that he was Sicilian. And when he kind of realized this, I talked to him many times over the course of months and even years as he was working through this revelation and this process of reckoning and what it meant to him. He did not feel Sicilian anymore, but he was not sure he could claim Blackness either because he hadn't lived it. And so for someone like Rosario, making this kind of discovery, it's not just a personal revelation, it's a familial revelation, and it's a kind of a process of historical reckoning to understand the forces that kind of created and divided his family and forced his family to make certain sacrifices and choices to deny essential parts of their identity, right? And so now he gets to reclaim that, but he's still also the person that he was before. He's both. And I find that story incredibly moving.
Thank you. I've got to remove this so I can talk.
Yeah, sure.
So you talked earlier about the tipping point, and I want to rephrase this question a little bit. So I think most people know about the Golden State Killer and how that came about. And you made me touch on it a little bit for those that are unfamiliar with it. But this becomes an ethics question about DNA testing in law enforcement. Can you address that?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I was writing the proposal for my book. I had actually just sold my proposal in the spring of 2018 when the Golden State Killer was arrested, the suspected Golden State Killer at the time. And I thought, well, that changes the book. And I wound up adding an entire chapter to the book to kind of talk about law enforcement. And as I was writing the book, it kept changing. And I kept having to update the book. And now I'm updating it for paperback. So it's incredibly complex, and it's a very fast moving world. But, in a nutshell, we've always had law enforcement databases that were used to solve crimes using DNA, right? We've always had law enforcement DNA databases, but they're very, very different from the use of DNA that's been gathered by consumers for the purposes of genealogical and family history research. And the DNA that's gathered for you to understand your great-great-grandfather, right? For you to do that genealogical research is much more rich and informative. And police have long wanted access to that information. But with the Golden State Killer, who was a serial killer and rapist, who was arrested in 2018, that was the first time that we know of that law enforcement used techniques that allowed them to identify a suspect based on consumer DNA. And they were able to do this by accessing private databases that were either not so well protected or didn't have great privacy policies, or where the owner made a unilateral decision to say, just come on in, solve this case, and I will make an exception to my rules. And so that has been an incredibly complicated sort of legal issue. And in the years since then, I think by one estimate, they've been able to solve over 200 cases using this technique, using certain databases that are easily accessible to law enforcement and not others. So 23andMe and Ancestry are not easily accessible to law enforcement, and to our knowledge have not been used in this way. But other databases that permit uploads have been used in this way, with greater or lesser degrees of cooperation. Sometimes without even meaning to be used this way, they've been used this way. And the majority of these people who are being arrested now using this new field that's called investigative genetic genealogy, the majority of these people are men, and it's mostly homicides and sexual assaults, and a lot of them are cold cases. So these are cases that have been unsolved for 40, 50 years, right? Police tried every technique they could. They tried DNA using law enforcement databases. It didn't work. And this has been a breakthrough. And so what you see is a real divide in between people who feel very strongly that these are such compelling cases that need to be solved, that this is okay. And some civil libertarians and privacy experts who say, this is a Wild West. This needs to be regulated. There needs to be guardrails. We need to know this isn't going to be used for really small crimes, right? And they're concerned about the kind of government creep of surveillance, which winds up implicating potentially people who otherwise would not be suspects. So this world is pretty unregulated. That's an important thing to know. And it's still in the process of being established. And it basically often involves, local law enforcement working hand in hand with genetic genealogists. So people who would have previously helped, for instance, an adopted person find their birth mother using certain genetic genealogy techniques that were pioneered for that use, they're instead taking crime scene DNA and they're uploading it to databases. And using those techniques that I was explaining before, you can find someone, you can identify someone even, from, say, a third cousin match or multiple third cousin matches.
Okay. So just a little bit more on this question. So are there any current court cases that you know of challenging the use of this consumer DNA for crime solving? Has there been any I mean, actual pushback other than people saying, discussing the ethics of it?
Yeah, there's only one court case that I know of that was, I think, in the summer of 2018. And it was not, I don't know a ton about it, but the effort to challenge it was not successful. However, my understanding is that there have since been additional decisions by other higher courts that could potentially change the outcome if another challenge was brought. So there are some people who think that this is ultimately going to need to be decided by a very high court, right? But it could be a very long time before we get there. And the technology kind of goes where it goes. And the regulation or the laws around it, I mean, they're going to be much slower to catch up.
Thank you. Do you see DNA tests that are being taken at home? Are they increasing or decreasing?
So direct-to-consumer DNA testing is growing much more slowly than it was. It hasn't flatlined yet, but there was a few years there where there was an unsustainable growth. If you look at the advertising that Ancestry put into ads, and I'm mentioning Ancestry because they spent the most and their ads are just so successful and so compelling. In 2016 and 2017, they spent $100 million in advertising both years. So $200 million in advertising, right? Which is why those ads are so ubiquitous and so familiar. And they really defined that world. And so if you were to look at a growth chart of how many people were testing, it was unbelievable. When I started writing my book, there were 8 million people or 8 million DNA test kits sold. 2 years later, there were 30. Right? Like, what? Now, I think we're above 35 million. So, you can see in the year and a half since then, it's grown, but it hasn't grown at the same slope. And that may be happening for a couple of reasons. One major reason is probably, according to the people who I talk to who are more expert in this, that they just vacuumed up all the early adopters, right? Like everyone who was willing to plunk down $99 on, because they were interested in family history research, those people may have kind of already been scooped up. There also may be privacy concerns connected to things like the Golden State Killer, and the idea that government may be accessing your information. Privacy concerns connected to the family privacy, right? Because over and over what you see is a kind of a collision between the interests of the person who tests and discovers surprise about their genetic origins, right? And then the parent level, who may feel that is their private business, that they don't, they don't really, this is, something they don't really want to talk about, the reality of how a child came to be. And the other privacy issues may have to do with concerns about things like genetic discrimination. Like if an insurer finds out, that I'm at high risk of such and such disease, something I discovered by taking a direct-to-consumer test, are they going to deny me coverage? Which is something that people are concerned about, though it hasn't happened yet, to my knowledge. So all those privacy concerns may be also part of what's making the growth, lessen.
Thank you. I got a question that's not on here. In your book, you said that, as so many Americans have taken their DNA test already, that I think you implied that if nobody else took their test today, you would still be able to find out ancestry based on what's already out there. That if we cut off DNA testing right now, there's enough information out there now for people just to find family history. Am I reading that right?
Yeah, I mean, you can find family and family history, certainly already. It depends whether you're wondering about an ethnicity estimate or DNA relatives, but you're going to be able to find both at the larger databases. Does that answer your question? I'm not quite sure I understand it.
Well, you said that what you said was that if we cut off DNA testing right now, there's enough DNA testing information through Ancestry and maybe Family Tree, and somebody may not even need to take testing. They just need names, and they could do the search on the DNA, like Ancestry, family tree, because that testing is going to be out there, or those results are going to be out there.
So, companies like Ancestry and Family Tree and 23andMe and MyHeritage, the four major DNA databases, that information you need to test with those companies, or have tested with another company and uploaded your information to one of the other databases, depending on how the databases work, in order to find matching relatives. So the information isn't public, in the sense that you could find out information about me if we're not genetically related. Does that make sense?
Yes. Yeah. Okay. Okay. So let's move on here. Do you encourage a DNA test? What advice do you have for people who are thinking about taking a home DNA test?
So it's such a complicated question. I mean, I think that, I've taken tests at 3 companies, and for me, it's been incredibly enriching. Our family had dabbled in genealogy before, but there are so many brick walls, right? There are so many places where you can only get so far back. The paper records don't exist, or the paper records wouldn't reveal something that DNA would. And so for our family, the ability to discover not only, more about our various branches of our family in terms of genetic ancestry, but then to find cousins was really extraordinary. And we found cousins, in Europe. So, those are cousins who are connected to us since before the various branches of our families emigrated. And in one instance, we were able to then go back to one of those home countries, which was Sweden. And we were able to meet our cousins who, are related to us going back to the 1800s, right? These are people we would never know otherwise, particularly because there was a break in the line, an NPE in the line. And so Sweden's prodigious paper records would not have reflected these cousins for us at all. On my mother's side, I am Ashkenazi Jewish, which is Jews from Central and Eastern Europe. And we discovered a whole branch of the family that survived World War II in Ukraine as Jews, taking whatever the 20th century had to throw at Jews living in Ukraine, right? And they made it out, and they made it to Israel, and they made it to Brooklyn. And without DNA, we would not know those people existed, because, along my mother's line, these are people who, her grandfather didn't talk about the people. He didn't talk about the however many 9 siblings or whatever that he left behind when he came to the US. So that to me is a kind of a gift and a blessing, like a pretty unbelievable gift. And at the same time, I've interviewed, hundreds of people about their genealogical journeys. And sometimes people's lives are so changed. And sometimes they're grateful for that. They'll say, even though it's painful, discovering the truth of my genetic origins has been a gift, right? I wouldn't take it back, even though it's complicated. And now, my family is different than it was. Still, I would rather embrace the truth of my identity because it's the truth. But I've also seen how that can kind of, how that can play out differently depending on your perspective. So, one person's grateful to know, and someone on the other side feels that the narrative of their family, or their truth of their family, their sacred truth, is threatened by this stranger coming into it, right? So it's so hard to say whether in one particular instance it is a blessing or it is something that people are not really kind of ready to embrace. And the kind of conundrum of it is that you don't know what you don't know until you take the test. So, one of the things I did was I went to, I made a couple of trips when I was writing the book. I went to Utah, and I visited the Family History Library, which is run by the LDS Church, which is the biggest genealogical library in the world. And I visited Ancestry's headquarters, which was really cool. And I also went to Texas, and I was able to visit the headquarters of Family Tree DNA, which is the oldest DNA testing company in the US. It's just over 20 years old. And I was interviewing the founder, a man named Bennett Greenspan, and he said to me, we were talking about the ethics of people discovering unexpected things in their own families and whether they're prepared for it and whether the companies properly prepare people for those kinds of surprises. And he said his philosophy is, if you don't want to know the answer to the question, don't ask the question. And I was thinking about it afterward, and I was thinking, but we don't even know the question that we're asking. Because perhaps you're interested in discovering the identity of your grandfather, and perhaps you never knew your grandfather. And you test, and then along the way, you find out that you have an older half sister, and that this revelation has implications for your father and your understanding of his loyalty to your mother. And then you are burdened with the fact that you have to think about whether to talk to him about it, and whether that means that you then have to tell your mom, and you're the messenger of this news, right? So it's incredibly complicated question to answer. And increasingly my answer to that question of, do you advise me to take a DNA test, is I say, I'm not going to answer that question, but I will flip it. And I will say that I think, the older generation of folks who are in possession of knowledge about their children, and maybe their children's genetic origins that their children themselves don't know, for very understandable reasons that they didn't disclose it up to this point, because the culture was radically different 60, 70 years ago. So it's very understandable. But this might be the moment to consider telling your children the truth, because what I found when I was interviewing people is that it is much better to find out through someone you love than from a computer screen that you are not who you thought you were.
Well, thank you, Libby. That's all of my questions. Charlene is going to take over here. Thank you again.
Yeah, thank you. That was really fun, Bob.
We're going to play musical chairs here.
Okay, that's fine.
Sorry, we ran into some problems earlier, but this is so fascinating. I think in 2008 is when we started doing, promoting DNA testing, and we were so excited. And now we're just wanting people to know, with all the sophistication of all the results, the things that can come up. Because before it was just we were matching our paper trail with our DNA trail, and I was just so pleased with what I found. But then I also found that our surname years ago wasn't what it was today. Did you run into any surname instead of MPEs? Did you run into just surname? At some point they may have changed the surname at some generation.
Yes, and it's incredibly frustrating. And again, can reflect the limits of the paper record, right? If you have a surname that's changed, and if that's not documented, then how do you discover that other than through DNA?
So DNA testing and genealogy itself has become very, very complicated. And this is a message that we are wanting, to send out, because I used to love to help patrons. So excited, I'd give them all the information I could. And adoptees were really hard. And then I wondered, oh my God, what if I'm giving information that could change so many lives, But as an information provider, I can't hold that information. I can't hold the tools, for this knowledge. So basically anymore, what I do is I just kind of tell them the truth. Okay, you're treading into something that, you may be surprised. It's kind of like a disclaimer, almost like a disclaimer, because, and that's because of the sophistication of the results. And because we're doing all the JED matches, that's what, the JED matches where everybody, all the companies can compare. So it's very complicated. And I think we don't want to discourage people from taking them, because, oh my God, I have found such wonderful information because of the DNA test that my relatives have taken, or I have taken. And so we don't want to discourage, but we want people to be aware of the new kind of information they can find out. So thank you so much. And my question to you is there anything crucial you want to add about your book that we haven't covered?
So I guess I would say, one thing that's important to know about The Lost Family is that I purposefully constructed it around a central mystery. because I was conscious as I was writing this science and genealogy book that it was for a mainstream audience. So it's intended for an audience that is not necessarily expert in genealogy and certainly not expert in genetics. And I am not expert in genetics, but I consulted a lot of scientists, and I had a geneticist read the manuscript so that I could be sure that it was explaining everything. But it's meant to be accessible, and it's meant to be a page turner. And the reason I say that is because I think, science books, I love science, and science books can be daunting. And so what I did was I found a really compelling story. The Washington Post said it's like an Agatha Christie mystery, that the Lost Family reads like an Agatha Christie mystery, because I found a kind of an existential whodunit. And it's the story of a woman named Alice, who is a retiree when she tests an ancestry, and she finds a mystery. And it takes her 2.5 years to unravel the explanation for her mystery. And it is not any of the kind of expected reasons that she has a surprise. So she has a significant surprise in her results. And she first assumes that she's the product of a non-paternity event, and then she figures she must be adopted. She's able to eliminate all the kind of more likely scenarios that would explain her truth through very methodical research and just basically dogged detective work. And ultimately, the explanation for her mystery takes her back 100 years. And so I got to do really cool historical research that was like so much fun. But the kind of heart of the book is these human stories. So it's Alice, and then it's many other stories from people I mentioned when we first started talking. That I originally wrote about this for the Washington Post, and I got this flood of reader email. A number of those stories of people who emailed me, I wound up interviewing those people, and a handful of them made it into the book. And some of the other stories in the book came from my reporting. So it's sort of, I think of Alice's story as the spine of a fish, because her story contains many others within it. And as you go along, and she's doing her detective work, and she's just such a compelling human being, and she's so sort of wise and funny, you kind of get to branch off, and you get to read about, as she dismisses the possibility that she could possibly be the product of a non-paternity event. I talk about non-paternity events as a phenomenon and how common they are, and some of the experiences of people who are embraced, and people who are pretty soundly rejected by their genetic fathers, and how they move on from that, and what they learn from that, and why they're still grateful to know the truth. So this is primarily a book about human nature, I would say, more so than science, although the science is incredibly important, just because I think that's what's important, and that's what interests me, and that's what I think we really need to be like talking and thinking about.
Thank you so much. And as a librarian, and in a library, and as the society, the Genealogy Society of Hispanic America, we bring up as much information or books, anything that will help people, to bring them to current status. So I'm going to open it up for questions right now. Are there any questions out there?
So if you want to ask a question, you can do it one or two ways. Unmute yourself and please raise your hand, or put it in the chat box, please.
So I see a question in the chat. Do you want me to read it out?
Sure, if you're able to see them, yeah.
So somebody wrote, "I'm just sharing that my father went missing in 1980. Wow. A detective placed his case on various missing persons websites. Then about 4 years ago, someone on the website called Web Sleuths, I'm familiar with that, figured out that he was an unidentified case in Sacramento County, California. Oh my gosh. Long story short, almost 4 decades later, I went to Sacramento to provide my DNA, and it was confirmed that the unidentified case was indeed my missing father. I give Web Sleuths some of the credit for helping find my father." That story is so moving. Thank you for sharing that. And I think, Web Sleuths is a community of people who solve crimes on their own. They're sometimes called the armchair detectives. And there's some overlap between Web Sleuths and the world of investigative genetic genealogy, which is those people who solve crimes, using consumer DNA. And I think what that points to that's very interesting is the world of citizen scientists and citizen sleuths that has really grown over the last few decades as a result of the internet, in great part, in these internet communities. And then, of course, genealogy and consumer DNA. There's things that are available at our fingertips that simply weren't before. And some people really, they decide that they want to solve cases themselves. The genetic genealogy was pioneered by just normal people, right? Not scientists. And many of the techniques that are used to help people find their family, those are techniques that individual people figured out. People, maybe they had a background in technology, but they were not coming from companies like 23andMe and Ancestry. And I think, that they were just individuals who were interested. And I think that's a really, really cool thing.
Okay, thank you so much. Bob, did you have anything else for now?
No, are there any other questions from our audience?
As we wait for questions, I'll mention that because I have a virtual book tour instead of an actual physical book tour, there's one thing. I mean, it's amazing that I can travel and I can be there with you, and I'm not actually there, and that's a wonderful thing. But I'm not able to sign books, which is something that I miss, and so I have arranged with a bookstore near my house in New York, where I can sign and personalize books, and they'll send them anywhere in the country. So if you're interested in a book, you can of course get it at your local library. You can get it at bookshop.org, which supports independent bookstores. You can get it at Amazon, but you can also get it at the Village Bookstore in Pleasantville, New York. And I'm going to pop that information into the chat. I think, see Charlene's holding it up. I'm popping it into the chat right now. Whoops. And the other thing is I have a newsletter, and I'm going to put that in as well. Hang on a second here. So if you want to get more information on DNA testing, hear about special offers, or see my columns that I write every month for Psychology Today, you can sign up for my newsletter, and I will promise not to bomb you with too many emails. So that should be in the chat now if you can see it.
Yeah, there was a question that came up here. Tom, just a second. It says, in your opinion, how accurate are the ancestry compositions from the DNA companies? Are they all dependent on their genetic communities and algorithms?
Yeah, so this person who asked this question put his finger on it, and he's very knowledgeable. There's a distinction to be made between DNA matching with genetic cousins that is very reliable. Ethnicity estimates are using different techniques that is grain of salt reliable. They're generally good continent by continent. When they start getting more granular, sometimes you get, one population that looks like another, and you may get something that's a little bit off. You may get stuff at the margins that is just noise, as it was described to me by one of the company scientists. I had for a while, I was 1% Korean, it eventually disappeared. The two main factors that are determining why those ethnicity estimates vary from company to company are indeed their reference populations. So those are the 500 or 1,000 or 4,000 or however many people are meant to stand in for all of a country, and the algorithms, which is the computer algorithm that is used to crunch that data, and that will vary from company to company. And that is why you will get different ethnicity estimates at different companies, and it's why every 6 months or so you might get an update and your results change a little. You haven't changed, your DNA hasn't changed, right? But the company is hopefully getting a little bit better at parsing it.
Okay, next, I don't know if it's a question or a comment. I'm searching for the biological father of my half-sister. We have the same mother, but different father. She has tested with FTDNA and Ancestry. Should she also test with 23andMe and MyHeritage for best results? We have no information on any male siblings she may have.
So this person who wrote in has done a really, she's tested an Ancestry, which is the largest database, and a genetic genealogist or a search angel would probably tell you to start there. So you're in the biggest and you're in the smallest of the databases. You certainly could test at 23andMe. 23andMe has about 12 million people in its database, and that is pretty darn big. You have to pay to test at 23andMe. MyHeritage, you don't have to pay. You can just download your results from Ancestry, I believe, and upload to MyHeritage. So that's kind of painless. But their database is only, I think, 4 million people, maybe a little bit more. So if you want to get more, bang for your buck, you could certainly do both, and you can do one of them for free. But I also wonder, I mean, I don't know what techniques you're using, but it could also be that you work with a search angel to help you make sense of the matches that you have in Ancestry. So that's another possibility. And search angels are people who work with people to help find genetic kin. And there are a lot of Facebook groups out there that will work with you. A lot of them are by demographics. So, if you're Irish, or you're African American from a particular region of sub-Saharan Africa, or you're Ashkenazi Jewish, there's a group for you on there. And that's helpful because often search angels and genetic genealogists, if they know the specific community, if they're familiar with working with the genealogy and the DNA of your specific community, they can be much more efficient.
Yeah.
So there may be a group for you on Facebook you can join if you haven't already, where you can float questions and maybe find someone who can hold your hand and help you make sense of those matches.
Yeah, I found one of those. What is it? Is it Search Angel? Is that what they're called?
Search
Yeah,
angels.
I found one for the first time in Pennsylvania. I had never heard of them, so I think maybe, Jeanette, for your question, maybe there is a Search Angel within our region. That would be my answer to that. And I know we have one of our Search Angels is Tom Martinez, I think. And so, Tom, I know you have a question, so please ask it.
Yeah, I don't know if it's so much of a question as it is a statement, but I think it needs to be emphasized that when law enforcement finds DNA at a crime scene, and they upload it to, let's say, GEDmatch, and then they find a third or fourth cousin, let's say, they still need family trees to connect the two.
Absolutely.
Without those trees, DNA by itself is not going to do it.
Absolutely. And that's an important thing to emphasize. You're absolutely right. And certainly, there's no magic to DNA on its own. Just testing and getting your list of genetic relatives, if you're not able to, or willing to, or find someone to help you do the paper trail, DNA alone without being in concert with the paper records is very challenging. And furthermore, figuring out the identity of someone from third and fourth cousin matches can be incredibly difficult because you are going back, you're going back many, many, many generations. So yeah, you're absolutely right, Tom.
Yeah, that's a great point, Tom, because we really encourage them. They go hand in hand. The paper trail and the genetic trail go hand in hand, and we try to really emphasize that. We have another question here.
Yeah, it says, with your experience, if you were to test today, which company would you be inclined to go with?
Yeah, so I'm, as a journalist, I'm not in sort of the business of like recommending one company over another. And I know that sometimes people will have specific preferences based on their specific interests and needs. But what I will say is that a lot of the genetic genealogists I know who are helping people search for family say that the size of the database is often the most important thing, right? Because with a big database, you are just simply more likely to find closer cousins, and closer cousins makes your work much easier. It is far easier to find the identity of someone if that's your goal, or even to do, potentially to do family history research. If you're finding first cousins than if you're finding fourth cousins. So with that said, I will now give you the size of the databases and you can make your own judgment. Ancestry is 18 or 19 million at this point. 23andMe is 12 million. MyHeritage is, I think, 4 or more. And Family Tree DNA is like 1.4 million people. And I should say, like, even 4 million people in MyHeritage's database, which doesn't sound that big compared to the 18 million in Ancestry, like a few years ago, that was really massive by the standards of just a few years ago. And the 12 million in 23andMe's database is significant. Some reasons why some people appreciate testing at a company like Ancestry is that there's the capacity to build a family tree and to share family trees. And also Ancestry and MyHeritage offer subscription-based archival materials, right? You pay a certain amount of money and you're able to access potentially billions of records. And that can be extremely helpful to understand the relevance of a particular DNA cousin that you're finding in the database.
Okay, I put a plug in for Family Tree DNA because it does the paternal and maternal. And I don't believe Ancestry or 23andMe or the others do that, right? They do more the autosomal. Is there another company that does do the paternal and maternal all the way back?
So Family Tree DNA is the only company that does the patrilineal and the matrilineal, which is like their very precise term for, it's not your entire paternal line, right? But it's your father's 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 father's. That's Y-DNA. Only men can take that test. Mitochondrial DNA, everyone can take that test. And it's just going to tell you about your mother's mother's mother's. And those types of DNA mutate very slowly. So they're going to reflect your ancient genetic origins, your ancient migration path of your people. So if you're interested in deep roots, that's the way to go. You're not going to be able to understand your more recent roots, a few hundred years ago. That's not going to be possible through that kind of testing for the most part, and or at least not as accessible for most people. And in terms of relatives, you may find matches, but it is extremely difficult to tell how closely related to you they are. So you're not going to be able to you're not getting the full picture. You're getting one specific branch, and you're getting pretty far back.
Yeah, when people come to me, for information on the companies, I always ask them, what is your ultimate goal? Do you just want to do 5 generations? Do you want to do all the way back, to ancestry? What do you want to find out? And so that's how I basically, tell them when I give them information on each, what is your ultimate goal? And I think everybody that's going to take a DNA test needs to ask themselves that. Is it just a trend? Do you want to say at a party, oh, I took my DNA test and I'm 50% Portuguese, because a lot of people do it just for that. So it depends on how serious they are. So I just do an interview. And then at the end, I honestly just do this disclaimer. And, it used to be a lot of fun for me. Now it's just really serious, really, really serious.
Yeah.
So are there any other questions from anybody? Do we have anything more on the chat?
I have a question.
Go ahead.
Can you hear me? Okay.
Identify yourself, please.
My name is Dorsha Bradley. I guess I could, here, I'll start the video there. Hi.
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 I'm one of those people, and this is my husband, John.
Hi.
We're in Claremont, California. I'm one of those, and I think it's fortunate persons to have had an NPE. My mother passed away several years ago, so I couldn't talk with her about this. It was obviously a secret that she kept, might not even known about. Part of the issue for people, and I think it's good for them to know that, it can certainly shake up the relationship you have with the parent. And maybe redefine it over time as you adjust and so on. I could not ask her, but it's interesting in that it also raised the question for me about how this happened and the hope that it wasn't a traumatic experience for her. I wondered, Libby, if there's, if you get into anything in your book about those dynamics, how there are going to be some questions that just can't be answered.
Yes, absolutely. That's a big theme for the people that I interviewed, for a number of reasons. Sometimes your parents aren't alive anymore, right? And you can't ask them certain basic questions. Sometimes you're finding somebody who is your genetic parent after they've passed away. You can't ask them if they knew about you, or if they looked for you, if they knew about you. And that is a kind of it's a very difficult question to not have answered, I think, for many people. And then there are people who their parents are alive and they can't have those questions answered because they can't have those conversations with their parents, because their parents don't want to talk about them, and because it is, again, the kind of the individual's desire to know themselves kind of colliding with the privacy interests of the parent. gosh, I tell a story in the book of a woman who she really wanted to know the identity of her genetic dad. She wasn't able to find it out from her mom. And she launched on genetic genealogy, right? She launched on DNA, and it was incredibly complicated because there was clearly, it was clear that her parents were related to one another. And so she told me about doing these massive family trees along the hallways of her home, where she had sticky notes of names and she would arrange and rearrange them. And she couldn't figure it out. Ultimately, she was able to figure out that her genetic father was her mother's first cousin. And when she called her mother and she asked her, her mother said that that it was true, and that that this woman was the product of a coercion, of a rape.
Mm-hmm.
And
that was the thing that
Yeah.
concerned me most of all, because out of love and respect for my mom, I'm hoping it was a lovely relationship she had.
Right. And to not know, of course, and then there obviously there are marriages and situations where they use a donor and they don't tell their children. And then the children are left wondering, was this a relationship outside the marriage? Was I donor conceived? Like, how will I know? So I think those questions, those unanswered questions, are very, very deep. What I found is that, this is a rewriting of yourself in many ways, because you can't discover that your own beginnings have changed without it changing the arc of the rest of your story, right? Your once upon a time changes, it changes everything else. And it's a profound thing. And when I would interview somebody who had made a discovery in 2013 and I would interview them in 2018, it wasn't over. These stories don't end. And I think sometimes in the newspaper coverage of DNA surprises, you get these tales where everything's wrapped up with a bow. Long lost sisters found each other and now they're so close. But it's not really wrapped up. It's always incredibly emotionally complicated. And I think that it's something that, you think back on your childhood, you footnote everything, because now every memory is a little bit different in context. And I got those, the stories from people, and they're threaded through the book, of that kind of, the rediscovery of the self, because you find out that your own origins are different, and then you think differently of your parents, and you often have those unanswered questions, those really big questions.
I think
Would your book be good for a book club?
It would, yes, absolutely. And I think, it would, yes. And if, what you could do is, if you want to go to my website, which is libbycopeland.com, hang on, I'm going to type it in the chat. You could email me. I have like a contact form there. Because I was just today talking with my publicity team. The book is coming out in paperback in a couple of months. And so paperback might be a nice thing for a book club, because it's just a few bucks cheaper, right? And we can run there's a discounts that they can run with paperbacks.
Oh, good, because I'm in line for April.
Oh, that would be perfect.
I'll get it for then.
That would be perfect.
Thank you so much, Libby.
Sure, thank you. Thank you.
So that was Libby putting up her.
Okay. Okay, so I guess our time is up, and this has been so interesting and so timely. And again, as libraries, we are responsible for bringing as many new books and new opinions and just all kinds of views into the world for people to know about. And our society also tries to keep up ahead of of what's happening out there with genealogy. So thank you, Libby, and thank you everybody that attended and asked questions, and buy the book. And one more thing, let's see if I can. We want to advertise the society, and our website is gshaa.org. gshaa.org, 2 A's. And then you can contact Bob Craig. His email is president@gshaa.org, president@gshaa.org. And if you have any comments or questions for me, my email is charlene.sims@pueblolibrary.org. So thank you, Libby, and we'll talk soon.
Thank you.
Thank
It's
you.
been my privilege to be here. I really appreciate it. Thank you. It was lovely to meet all of you.